About to leave, already packing. Come with me, I'm not really asking. We'll get away to a place where we don't know. About to see the world in action, what we can be, life with no distractions. We'll get away, this is what we waited for. Take my hand, we'll make it somehow. We can't miss out. I'm done living life with the lights out. Die with my own doubts. Be free with me. Let's be free with Not looking back, eyes on the freeway, Bonnie and Clyde, a classic cliche. We're on the run, this is what we waited for. Take my hand, we'll make it somehow. We can't miss out. I'm done living life with the lights out. Die with my own doubts. Be free.
Good evening, and welcome to our latest live stream, which today is going to be on globalisation and education policy, which I know is a lot of people's favourite topic. It's one that people ask about a lot. We'll talk about that again in a minute. I'm joined this evening by Craig. How are you doing, Craig?
I'm good, Duncan. Yeah, it's a bit cold up here, but you know,
it's a bit cold here as well, to be fair.
It's getting a bit wintry now.
It does feel a bit wintry. Lovely that lots of people are joining us here this evening. You can also watch us on catch up, so some of you might be watching this not live. If you are watching live, then you can join in the chat window like Emir has just done. I hope we're all right, thank you. Yeah. And if you're not, you can't join in the chat window, but yeah, you can maybe pause the video at certain points and things, have a little bit longer to think about some of the questions and things like that. Okay, I think without much further ado, we will get going with a range of activities and some information about globalisation and educational policy. As I mentioned right at the start, that it's something that we get asked about a lot. It is obviously mentioned on the specification, and it's one where people say, oh, what sort of a question could I be asked about this? How could this come up? And things like that. So on that basis, we thought we'd cover it today and have a think about it. So let's get started then. So just to get us thinking, first of all, a quick starter activity. You got 10 seconds. It's going to be a rocket. We're going to have blast off. 10 seconds just to think about, and I reckon some of you will be able to just give a complete super speed answer to this one. Name a policy that the UK has borrowed from the Swedish education system. Not need 10
Liftoff will start
seconds.
in T minus 10 seconds. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We have ignition.
Oh, our 10 seconds are up. Anyone got it? Policy that UK borrowed from the Swedish education system. We're kind of introducing you to one aspect of globalisation of education, which is educational policies might be that have been seen to be successful or considered to have been successful in other countries might be adopted here. And before we ever had them, Sweden had free schools is the answer to that one. Now, interestingly, at the time when Michael Gove decided that we should have free schools like the Swedish, Sweden was very high up the international rankings, and people were saying maybe a lot of it's got to do with these schools that are independent of local authorities, and these new schools that have been built. Within a couple of years, Sweden had started falling down the rankings, and people in Sweden were discussing whether maybe they should get rid of the free schools. So we possibly wasn't necessarily the right policy to borrow, but we did anyway. So that is that was that one. Okay, Craig's going to talk to us a little bit about the impacts of globalisation.
Okay, thank you, Duncan. Yeah, free schools are one of the many kind of ways that globalization has impacted on our education system. But this thread of globalization runs right throughout the course. And I'm sure, sort of like as you're going through the course, you probably said, "Oh, not globalization again," because it runs through pretty much every topic area. Obviously, things like family, we talk about globalization and family. We talk about globalization and crime, the different types of crime that have increased because of globalization, through beliefs, things like fundamentalism, religion in a global context, and media and culture. Of course, sort of like we talk about global culture and the impacts of the media on global culture. But in relation to education, it means it's very, very specific about what they want you to think about globalization. Now, globalization does have other impacts, but very specifically, you may get asked a question on how globalization has influenced educational policy. Because on the specification point, it says globalization in relation to educational policy. So if they were going to ask you that type of question, how have some of the features of globalization influenced educational policy? And I will say largely they will focus on England, because obviously England, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland all have slightly different variants on education system. But generally we talk about the UK, but they were more likely to focus on England and Wales more than anywhere else. I think the Welsh education system is slightly different because it's devolved, isn't it, Duncan?
It is, yes. So,
you're a little bit more up on politics than I am. But I know the Welsh education system is slightly different to the UK, and it has devolved responsibilities to the National Assembly, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's a little different, but not as dramatically so as Scotland and Northern Ireland, which is why they often talk about England and Wales together in relation to education. But it does, the Welsh Assembly, Welsh Parliament now does have some control over the education policy. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like particularly during like COVID lockdowns and things like that. What you saw the Welsh schools had different criteria applied to them. Well, the other thing to note, and this is something that we talked about last week, is this idea that policies can be both internal, and that is one school being influenced by globalization and coming up with their own policy, or external. Now, this has been imposed by the government. So if you get asked this question, we can see different aspects of it. It doesn't have to be a policy that is applied nationwide. What you could talk about is the way in which globalization has impacted, for example, on the way a school purchases its goods from somewhere. Okay, so we'll come and look at some of these as we go through this session. What we're focused on here is what are some of the big impacts of globalization. And as you can see, we've spared no expense. We've got a spinning globe this week. You can clearly see I've been working on my IT skills from one week to the next. I've managed to create a spinning globe. And when we talk about globalization, we're talking about some key features. And this then leads to educational policy. So these are key social changes that occur because of globalization, which then necessitate a government or a school creating a policy because of those. So, for example, one big feature of globalization is migration. People move from place to place, they move into the UK, they move out of the UK. And of course, they move and go and see different places as well. So that kind of links into our other one at the bottom there, influence of other cultures. Growth of transnational corporations. Now, it depends which way you want to view this. Some will see this as being a positive thing. Our kind of Marxists will say it's the growth of capitalism and growth of exploitation. So what we have here is have we seen more companies, more transnational companies become involved in the education system? And we'll see how this might link into another aspect of educational policy in a little bit. Global comparisons. This is one that you may have covered in your textbooks, things like PISA rankings, TIMSS rankings. I don't think I'm giving too much away just now. Changes to the job market and how that might have impacted on globalization, on educational policy. Now, we can talk about changes to the job market and how it has an impact on things like the crisis of masculinity. But then we also can focus on changes to the job market and how we apply it to a specific policy. And also greater insecurity. So very much the kind of late modern view of risk society, which comes from globalization. So things like the war on terror, fears about terrorism, fears about
climate change,
online grooming. Climate change is another good one as well, which we can mention in here too. So some of the kind of risks that are associated with increased globalization that has occurred. Now we've looked at some of the features of impacts of globalization. We're going to try and pick these features and see if you can name a policy that has been influenced by this feature. So we're going to do our connection spinner and we're going to spin. We've got those 6 categories in there again. And we're going to spin and see which category comes up. So greater insecurity, migration, growth of TNCs, influence of the cultures, global comparisons and changes to the job market. Can you identify a policy either internal or external that has been influenced by the growth of transnational corporations, the growth of big companies? So think about education and think about where big companies have started to become involved in education. Can you think of any examples?
I feel I should point out at this point that TutorTU is not a transnational corporation.
No, not at all.
So it's something you can talk about potentially when you talk about the role of private companies in education, but we'll be talking about bigger companies than TutorTU.
Yeah, I think TutorTU is based in one. Am I right in saying it's based in one country?
It is based in one country. Yeah.
I don't
county.
Think we do.
No.
Does it count as transnational if we do Wales?
Yeah. It's not that people, of course, can't access. Another feature of globalization, people can access from other countries, but the actual companies are, based in one country. Anyone want to suggest anything? There's a few ways. It could be
big companies.
If you think about your own school, I was just going to say, if you think about your own school, I bet there might well be ways that big companies have feature in your school life, and then you might be thinking, how does that link to a policy?
And alternatively, if you are watching this and you're doing A-level sociology overseas, what might you have in common with some of the students who are based in the UK doing this qualification?
Yeah, so just because Isaac's asking for a bit more explanation. So we're looking for ways in which the growth of transnational corporations, so big companies like Google, Apple, McDonald's, Coca-Cola, but also other companies that perhaps, some of those do have quite a lot to do with education actually, but perhaps some others that have more so, have had an impact on education policy in a very broad definition of education policy. So that might be things that the government have brought in, changes the government have made, or it might be things that happen within schools. And there are a few things that there could be there. I know I'm going to start with one example myself. Oh, and Alex is talking about marketisation of schools, and it could well link. There could well be a link to marketisation of schools.
We will look at that in our next activity. So, Alex,
Yeah.
you kind of on the line there, but think about when we talk about marketisation of schools, we're thinking about if you think about maybe some of the features that are in your school. Sorry, Duncan's just mentioned a company that you may have, and
Yeah.
particularly kind of in that kind of post-COVID era, that you may
Yeah.
have
Yeah.
more of them in your school now.
I'm going to give one away just because it's been on my mind a lot this week. So my daughter's been showing me her homework, etc. Everyone at the school has an iPad. Okay, that is a school policy. And iPads, they're like Apple, so Apple is a transnational company and had a big impact on a lot of schools, not just there are quite a lot of schools where they might have a particular device, not necessarily Apple.
Indeed,
But that
you
would
probably
be one
find.
policy.
Well, not quite necessarily the growth of TNCs. Well, I suppose it can be transnational companies. We are going into the realms of privatization as well. Where you talk about something, many schools have their lunches provided by similar people.
And sometimes it might be a transnational corporation. Yeah, not always. Right.
Mm.
You were
Let's have a
obviously
look at the
hinting
answer.
at. I was going to say you were obviously hinting at Google schools, weren't you, earlier, and
I
Google
was.
Classroom
Google
and things like
Classroom.
that. Yeah.
Use of Google Classroom, increased use of technology within the education system. So particularly sort of like if you were, during the COVID lockdowns, you were having sort of like Zoom or you're having Teams meetings, but also sort of like the fact that many schools do that. Sadie's going with better international education. Yes, you can use that growth of transnational corporations because what you have is some schools will have sites overseas. So, for example, I know Harrow has an international school. Harrow has international schools, and they've spread out across the globe. So you can see that being transmitted. Lots of universities as well will open campuses overseas. Do we have trips in sociology? I think that
You'll have
depends on your
to ask your
individual
teacher
school.
about. Yeah, you'd have to ask your teacher about that.
It'd be really cool. Try and link in a trip into the globalization of sociology and sort of like get
Yeah,
your school to do an exchange with South Korea or Beijing or Hong Kong or somewhere like that. That'd be really cool. But yes, also the expansion of educational companies. What I was hinting at before when I was talking about how some international students. So, for example, I often get requests to do things on Cambridge International. As a board, which obviously is very similar to in the UK, Oxford Cambridge Resourcing (OCR). They are that as a company has become massive. Pearson's is another one,
yeah.
and with things like EdXL, and they have spread out and they supply educational services across the globe. I'm not quite sure about AQA and whether they do a lot of overseas qualifications, but I would imagine that there will be some places that do AQA qualifications. So that's spread overseas of a British-based qualification elsewhere.
They do the international A-levels and GCSEs, but it's obviously a different, slightly different style organisation from say Pearson, but some of these are for-profit companies and some of them are not, and all that kind of thing. But they're interesting impact, definitely.
Let's spin it again and let's see if we can find something that we can get more into.
I'll do. I was just going to say some of these things link together as well, don't they? Because of the growth of TNCs globally will have had an impact on changes to the job market, and so you can start linking these things together as well. But anyway, here we go. Next one.
Let's have another spin. Let's see if we get something different this time.
Well, what if it lands on growth of TNCs again? That'd be annoying, wouldn't it? Oh.
Okay. Influence of other cultures. Right. Okay. Globalization, of course, has influenced UK culture massively. We've started to see, we've had many impacts of globalization on our culture, particularly if you do culture and identity, or if you do any of the different modules, you can talk about the influence of global culture. But how has it influenced educational policy? How have our schools changed? Or how has our government reacted to the influence of other cultures? What might it have done? Excellent, Sadie.
Yeah.
Very quickly. A broader curriculum, less ethnocentrism, which is very much what one of the reasons that I've gone for increased multiculturalism or decolonizing the curriculum. There are some others in there, so I'll just leave it for a second. There are some other ideas that you could bring in. Introducing the faith schools, excellent. You could link that into globalization. Obviously, as we have the influence of other cultures, and you can also link that to migration as well. So like the growth of faith schools, particularly under the likes of New Labour, and then of course, I think the existing Labour government are looking to increase faith schools as well, aren't they?
I think I have
I
heard
think that was
something
one
on
of their
those lines.
manifesto pledges, allow the more choice in faith schools. Of course, you've kind of got the other side of that. Obviously, there was the kind of Trojan horse scandal, and the ways in which certain faith schools were targeted by Ofsted, and the other influence of other cultures. The kind of negative side of it, or influence of other cultures, is you get things like British values and prevent, which probably links into greater insecurity, where they try to reinforce this kind of British values across the curriculum, as what we would see as being an integration, or an assimilation policy, rather than integrating other cultures into the curriculum. But what we initially went with was increased multiculturalism and the decolonizing the curriculum. So you get lots of calls to decolonize the curriculum. So well done, Sadie.
If you've not heard that term before, decolonizing the curriculum, obviously it's kind of, particularly in the UK, there's the history of empire and it's trying to take out some of those cultural assumptions that maybe exist from the past,
to make the curriculum more inclusive and to more representative of sort of like the population of the UK today. Right, so we've mentioned this a little bit already, where what we have is, when we're talking about globalization and educational policy, often a policy might have been influenced by globalization, but it has other impacts on the educational system. So its main aim might have been to copy something that was overseas, or it might have been influenced by the growth of TNCs or something, but it's also had a secondary impact. And this happens with a lot of educational policies. I think we touched on this a little bit last week, which means that those policies that have multiple impacts are really, really good ones to know, really good ones to revise, because you can use them to answer several different types of questions. An example of this is academies. Now, academies is a really good example of a policy that, whilst it had certain aims, it also had multiple impacts. Okay, so academies, when they were first introduced, they were influenced by the US education system, particularly the charter school system in the United States, that copied, basically the academies, the first city centre academies copied the US charter school system. But they also did other things. They introduced privatization of the education system, because academies were run by private companies. They received government funding, but were managed by a private company. Okay. They also increased marketization by giving parents more choice. And one of their original aims was to tackle inequality. Okay. And the early city centre academies did a reasonably good job of tackling inequality. So you can see there, from this one policy, you can use it to answer 3 or 4 different types of questions. It's been influenced by globalization. It's led to increased privatization, led to increased marketization. And one of its key aims was to tackle inequality. So we're going to look at a number of different policies now and ask you to name, has this policy achieved how many of these different kind of impacts? So with the bubble quiz, for those of you who haven't done a bubble quiz before, because we haven't done this series, the correct number of answers is 0 to 4. So it could be, the answers could be A, B, C, D, it could be A, B, it could be none of them. What we want you to do when you see a question is put down the letters that you think it fits, the correct answers, into the chat window. So our first question here is, which of the following impacts did the introduction of free schools have? Now, Duncan mentioned this before. It's very much a policy that's been influenced by globalization, but what else did it do? A, marketization. B, tackle inequality. C, change the curriculum, or D, increase privatization? Which of those do we think that free schools did as well as being a policy that's influenced by globalization? So if you think about these one at a time, so did it increase parental choice or competition between schools? Did it fulfill the idea of marketization? Did free schools tackle inequalities? We could possibly have a debate over this.
Yeah.
Does
I
it
was just thinking
change the curriculum? And again, remember whether it's internal or external, the impacts of internal and external policies. Do free schools, are they able to change the curriculum in any way? And privatization, are they run by private businesses or do they encourage private investment? So Alex has gone for A and C. And I will say, Alex, you're correct. Are there any others? Oh, Duncan's already revealed it. It did
Yeah.
all of them.
Yeah,
It
I
did
mean,
all of them.
B's an interesting one, isn't it? When they were first introduced in Sweden, one of the main rationales for introducing them in Sweden initially was exactly to tackle inequalities. And if you think about Sweden being this very large rural country, and obviously there's a couple of big cities, but everyone else lives sort of out in the countryside. There were parts, particularly in the north of Sweden, where schools were either getting closed or there wasn't a local school and people were having to travel very long distances to school. And so the idea that parents could essentially set up a school in their local community, even if the government couldn't really afford to set one up, was a way that they could tackle that inequality, the regional inequality in the schools. So that was one of the rationales behind the original Swedish free schools.
I will also say to you, that not all free schools were set up by parents. Some free schools were set up as alternative provision. So a couple of examples that I know of are football clubs. Everton set up their own free school, which sets up an alternative provision for students who are 14 to 19, which gives them more opportunities in specific, usually for sort of like kids who didn't the traditional educational system didn't suit them. West Bromwich Albion, I think they had a free school which was very well received and did very, very well. West Brom free school, and also we can link that into privatisation. So whilst there is a debate over whether they tackle inequalities, the fact that they provide alternative provision for students who might not fit into mainstream education means that potentially they can be seen to aim to tackle inequalities. There is always the thing with free schools is everyone thinks, oh, it was middle-class parents who set them up and allowed middle-class kids to go there. There's lots of kind of examples of free schools that have done very badly. There's also some examples of free schools that have done really well as well. It's like any kind of organization in many ways, is that there are good ones and there are bad ones. But obviously they do invite private investment into them. So therefore they fulfill privatization as well.
In terms of changing the curriculum, they could set up their own. I mean, in that respect, they're essentially the same as academies, aren't they? Really, they're just like new academies. Just on that,
they can offer their own curriculum. They can offer alternative provisions, so therefore they change the curriculum.
I was just saying on the sort of evaluation of them. Obviously, the Swedish ones are a little bit different, but one of the criticisms in Sweden was that they actually sort of increased segregation, both social and other forms of segregation. And that's interesting from an equality perspective as well. Okay. Sorry.
Number 2.
Next one.
That's all right. Which of the following impacts does the introduction of PISA rankings have? Now, we all know, we may have heard about PISA rankings. This is tests that are done. I think it's extended to over 70 countries now, maybe even more. I think the most recent PISA rankings have come out, which are the first ones since COVID. I know the UK has leapt up the PISA rankings recently. But PISA rankings, tests in tests in literacy, maths, and science. They were originally, they led to comparisons, shall we say, between schools. and education systems, and therefore people could cherry pick the best ideas. That's the globalization aspect of it. But what other impacts did PISA rankings have? So, has it A, increased funding for STEM, science, technology, engineering, and maths? B, has it promoted multiculturalism? C, selective education. And this would be where sort of like schools will select pupils. And D, changes to maths and English teaching.
If we put it in a little bit of context now, as Craig mentioned, the UK has gone up the rankings quite impressively, but a number of years ago we were probably disappointingly low.
There has been there was quite a big gap between them, wasn't it? Normally the gap is about 2 to 3 years.
Yes.
And I think it's about 5 years, or so years gap between the most recent publication and before. The UK was around about 20th in certain subjects and has leapt up, I think, into that low teens. Is it now? I think it got into. I think it was 11th for one subject.
Yeah. And it's overtaken some of the countries that historically we've looked to emulate, which is interesting.
Okay, remember the PISA rankings were based on science, maths, and English. Bit of a hint there. Okay, let's see the answers. I think it's a tough one.
It is pretty tough.
It is a tough one, but it's useful to know. Yeah. Oh, Alex has gone for A, C, and D. Well, you were right with A and D, Alex. Not necessarily selective education, but it's certainly increased funding for STEM and changes to maths and English teaching. So, sort of like what we would do is what happened is that they cherry picked a lot of the ideas in terms of mastery approaches to teaching maths, which many kids in primary schools do now. They have very rigid ways in which they do maths. Increased funding for STEM, because Britain was seen as lagging behind other major world countries or major developed countries, sort of like in terms of science, and so they put more funding in for science, technology, engineering, and maths, and also doing things like compulsory research, and even the kind of now abandoned plan of Rishi Sunak to expand the teaching of English and maths to 18.
The British standard. Just quickly, just to update on us on that, so the current standing is UK is the 11th in maths and 13th in both reading and science. The 11th in maths, that's up from 17th in 2018 and 27th in 2009. So that's quite a significant change. The thing with the selective education, that was an interesting one, Alex, because this is measuring the UK education system as a whole rather than individual schools. It hasn't had that same sort of impact that you might get with national league tables, if you like. So that's probably why you don't see. We wouldn't necessarily link it with either official or covert selection policies. Thinking back to things we were talking about last week, you can watch that one again. It's on YouTube if you didn't see us last week. Okay, sorry.
Question number 3. Which of the following impacts did British values have? Now, British values obviously introduced in correct me if I'm wrong here, Duncan, 2014?
That sounds about right. I haven't got the exact number.
2014. Yes, it was certainly under the coalition government.
Yes.
In 2014, it brought in impacts of sort of like British values, things like democracy, rule of law. You will see these posters in your schools. It is an impact of globalization, particularly in the aftermath of radicalization and terror attacks. And sort of like the idea is, right, we want to stamp on British values on there. So what other impacts did British values have? Did it A, help us teach specialist skills, B, lead to privatization, C, transmit norms and values, or D, reinforce social solidarity?
Sadie's gone ACD. I'm going to say...
That's from the last one.
Oh, do you think it might be?
It might be.
I was going to say 2 out of 3. I'd agree with 2 of those. It was pretty quick, but yeah, same. Maybe just C and D, Sadie.
And Sadie, you are correct. Yes,
well done.
It does transmit norms and values, and it does help to reinforce social solidarity. Okay, so reinforce social solidarity, the idea, right, okay, these are British values. Everybody needs to conform to them. And of course, British values transmit norms and values. totally straightforward. So you can
So,
use things like British values to actually say, like we were talking about last week, how educational policy can reinforce the functions of education. You could use that one there too.
yeah, by teaching specialist skills, kind of talking about more like kind of vocational skills, skills that you require in a particular specialism. So that would be, yeah,
Yeah.
rather than say knowledge of values. Okay.
Okay. Now, this is one that some people may not have come across. The global citizenship education. It tends to be embedded on a lot of mark schemes. Teachers may know more about this than pupils, although, we have to talk about global citizenship education, things like sustainability and things like that. This is a relatively new one, relatively new on here. It was the idea is that we are all part of the one planet, and we have certain attitudes that we need to display in terms of sort of like being a global citizen. So sustainability and technology, lots of different concepts in there. What does it do? Does it A, tackle inequalities, B, increase privatization, C, marketization, or D, promote multiculturalism? This one may be a bit more straightforward. Sadie's gone for A and D. Let's see the answers, Duncan. Well done, Sadie. Yes, tackling inequalities and promoting multiculturalism. It's about being kind of a more considerate citizen, about sort of like promoting sustainable ideas, sort of like not overusing resources and so on and so forth. Let's go to question number 5. Realizing we're taking up half the session on the first few sessions. Okay, which of the following impacts did changes to apprenticeships and vocational training have? Now, apprenticeships and vocational training have been influenced by other countries, namely Germany. Okay, this is something that's not in too many textbooks, but the reintroduction of apprenticeships is influenced by the German further education system. Okay, so what other impacts might reintroducing apprenticeships, where an individual go and work for a company and be educated at the same time? What might it? Which of those might it tackle? Well, which of those impacts might it have had as well? Increased marketization, privatization, tackling inequalities, and teaching specialist skills. Alex has gone A and D, and I would say both of those are correct. Are any others correct? It did create an additional market because what it's doing is it's giving people more choice of where they can go. They can choose to go for an apprenticeship rather than do A levels or go down the university route. Sadie's gone with C as well, tackles inequality. We can certainly talk about this in terms of social class inequality, trying to get a parity of esteem between academic and vocational qualifications, because vocational qualifications tend to be more focused on by the working class. The one that you might not get is privatization.
I was going to say, who provides the apprenticeships? Who are the providers when it comes to apprenticeships?
Lots of apprenticeship providers are done through private provision, and this is where the government will fund them through something that's called the apprenticeship levy, which we're getting into stuff that's off the spec now. But the idea would be is if you get a question on privatization, if you were to ever get a question on privatization of education, you could potentially talk about apprenticeships and private providers training pupils. Okay, so now we're going to evaluate some. There's a couple of policies that we've picked out here, and we're going to look at some evaluations. Last week we talked about this kind of acronym, I should say, last week. Let's talk about an acronym: strength, criticism, alternative, limitation, or evidence on how we make an evaluation. Can we find a strength of something? Can we find a criticism? Can we find an alternative? Can we find a limitation, something it doesn't explain? Or can we find some evidence? We've got 2 student statements here. The first one is about the PISA rankings. The use of international ranking systems such as PISA have introduced new ideas to the education system from different nations such as China and South Korea. So what you've got here is you've got students that has made this point. Now what we want to do is evaluate it, and we are going to evaluate it using a criticism. So how can we criticize that point that the student has made? The student has said the PISA ranking system brings new ideas from nations like China and South Korea to the UK.
what would be a criticism of bringing of trying those ideas out in the UK, perhaps?
I mean, we know that the Chinese and South Korean education systems have got really good results in the PISA rankings.
Particularly in
Sorry,
maths.
my voice has gone high then.
Yeah, that's all right. Particularly maths, and we have imported some ideas from there. But we could look at if we'd been asked for evidence or strength, we could have looked at the data we were just talking about then, and now we'd moved up to 11th, and maybe it's been effective. But what could be a criticism?
Maybe think about, differences. So if we think about some of the differences, maybe. Doesn't help students not interested in STEM subjects or less able. Excellent. Yeah, you could say that. It doesn't doesn't go across a wide range of subjects. So things like the humanities, for example, or art. Although, because they are not in the PISA rankings, yes, you could certainly use that, Alex, as an evaluation. We've gone a bit more straightforward than that, and we've discussed how there are cultural differences between the
Neve.
UK.
Yeah, Neve's got it.
Oh, sorry, yeah, Neve, well done. Just came in there. Yeah. Cultural barriers. Yeah, cultural differences between the UK and these nations means the ideas may not have the same impact on British students. If you've ever watched it, I think we've done it in our grade boosters before. The school swap with South Korea, and they take some Welsh students and they take them to South Korea and they show them doing the maths tests, and you see the kind of huge cultural difference kind of between what they perceive as being a difficult maths test and what we perceive as being a difficult maths test. And of course, those ideas were then adopted into the UK. Our next one, academies. We've talked about academies before. Initially introduced as the city centre academies under New Labour and based on the US charter school system, which had performed well in international rankings. So that's an influence of globalisation. How do we evaluate it? Well, let's look for something. Let's see. A limitation. Okay, so let's look for something it doesn't explain. What does this not explain? So they brought in these city centre academies that are based on the US charter school system. They'd performed well in the international rankings. What does it not explain? Or what's a limitation of the argument? The academies performed well in the US. Think about, how do they perform in the UK? Maybe.
Lots of them perform well, but not necessarily all of them.
That's the US charter school system, and particularly we would actually say, if you actually do any kind of research into the US charter school system, the original ones, same with academies, were really good, did really well. Particularly thinking about one that was featured in a TED Talk, the Harlem School, and it was featured in a TED Talk with a guy called Jeffrey Canada. Very, took kind of kids from working class areas in Harlem and sort of like educated and spent lots of money on it. But then that system rolled out elsewhere in the US, and there were some horror stories of schools closing down and all sorts. Let's have a look at what limitation is in the UK system. Well, there's a two-tier kind of system in the UK of academies. There are sponsored academies, those that were forced to be taken over. This is because they underachieved academically. Very much a big part of Michael Gove's educational policy, sort of like in the 2010s onwards, schools that had failed to achieve, I think it was 40% of pupils getting 5 A-star to C grades at GCSE, could have gone to forced academisation. And then we also have converter academies which tend to perform really well. These were schools that were good schools initially and have given themselves more options. So a limitation of the argument is that not all academies in the UK perform to a high standard. Many of those that were forced academies actually perform worse once they've become academies than they did when they were part of local education authority control.
Okay, we've talked quite a lot today about privatisation and marketisation, even though they're not only in the context of globalisation, you can talk about them beyond globalization, but we have used the terms quite a lot today. So I thought it would be a useful opportunity just before we finish, just to check our understanding of these concepts, really. So we've got a definition here of privatization, a definition of marketization. Do the phrases and definitions match? Sadie's come in very quickly and says yes, they do. Privatization, something that was once owned or controlled by the state being transferred to being owned or controlled by a private company or individuals. And marketization, the introduction of more competition and consumer choice. You are indeed correct. Those phrases and definitions match up correctly. They're the right ones. Okay, we've got one more of these. We can divide privatization up into exogenous and endogenous privatization. This was Udall and... Oh, God, Craig's going to help me here. Yeah,
I hope I can.
What were they called?
Specific study, not Gilborn and Udall. That was educational triage.
Yeah, they did talk about it was definitely Udall anyway. Who talked about endogenous? Yeah. Anyway, yes. I think it was Gilborn. I think it might have been Gilborn and Udall, but just in a different thing that they wrote from the educational triage. They talked about two types of privatisation: exogenous and endogenous privatisation. Craig's got his textbook out now, so we'll
I do
get this in a moment, but it might not be in the right textbook.
I'm double checking because it rings a bell in terms of sort of like the actual the study, and I don't like it when I forget something.
So here we've got two terms, exogenous and endogenous. Exogenous, the outsourcing of educational services to private companies. Endogenous, schools themselves behaving more like private companies as a result of marketisation. Sadie is saying that's right, and it is indeed right. I've got a slight concern. I should have tested this, that the system's going to pretend I'm wrong. It's not going to swap. No, that's okay. I just had a worry then because I'd intended one of them to be to need to swap. But anyway, we didn't need to. Well done, Sadie. You spotted that and you were correct. Yes. So exogenous privatisation is essentially what we would think of as being actual privatisation, what we'd normally mean by privatisation, the role of private companies, external to the school, if you like. It gets slightly complicated with academies and free schools because, of course, the schools are themselves private companies, which when Udall was first writing about this, that was a fairly unusual feature. So initially, by endogenous privatisation, they were really referring to essentially marketisation. They were saying that marketisation was like privatisation because the schools behaved like private companies. But of course, today, quite a lot of schools actually are run by private companies themselves. So you can go beyond what was in the original definition of endogenous privatisation.
Ball and Udall.
I knew Udall was involved.
Ball and Udall 2007.
There we go. Ball and Udall. Yeah, excellent. Okay, so we will come back to the studio. You can tell we're not in a studio. I don't know why I call it a studio. But anyway, okay. Some lovely answers there. Well done, guys. Some difficult stuff. This is often picked. Yeah, we picked this because people, teachers had suggested this was a topic that students often found tricky, and so that's why we picked this one. Well done. Your answers.
It's certainly quite a tricky topic because it is a relatively new thing. I mean, a lot of the policies that we've discussed here have occurred in the last 15, 20 years. And lots of them may or may not be mentioned in the textbooks because many of the textbooks will be written in 2014, 2015, and we will see newer policies coming in as being impacted by the impacts of globalization. It's a very difficult topic. I think the other thing as well in terms of globalization generally as a topic is globalization really, many students who are doing their A-levels this year have grown up in a global society.
Yeah.
So to understand what it was like 30, 40 years before you were born is quite a difficult skill. And so focusing on those kind of key ideas that we talked about, things like migration, the growth of capitalism, and how these have an impact on different aspects of globalization is really important. And think about the kind of key features of globalization and then apply them to the different areas when you look at globalization.
Because, yes, it's not just in education, it's in everything. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, thanks very much, Craig. Thanks very much, guys, for joining us. Next time, I believe we're looking at we're having loads of policies, but I think it's families and policies next time. So if you do families or did families in year 12 or are doing families now, then do join us. I appreciate some of you'll do culture and identity and work, poverty and welfare and health, and so you might not want to join us next week. You might do, because some policies for the family may well be relevant in other areas as well. Feel free to join us if you want to, but we will be focusing on families and policy next time. Okay, cheers guys. See you soon. Bye bye.
Right.